So, good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Delia Baldassari and I'm an assistant professor here in sociology. On behalf of the Public Lecture Committee and of a large Princeton community, I'm honored and delighted to welcome President and Professor Romano Prodi, which will deliver the Walter E. Edge Lecture. The Edge Lecture Fund was founded in 1957 in memory of Walter E. Edge, class of 1946. Edge served twice as governor of New Jersey and also as United States Senator and ambassador to France. The lectureship is supported by a bequest from his estate assigned to the university by his family as a means of bringing to Princeton eminent statesmen from abroad as well as leaders in American public life. Previous Walter E. Edge lecturers include George Kennan, John Kenneth Galbraith, Edward Heath, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, Elie Wiesel, Robert Rubin, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So, pretty good company. Our speaker, Professor and President Romano Prodi, will be introduced by Professor Andrew Moravcsik. Andrew Moravcsik is a professor of politics and international affairs and director of the European Union program at the Woodrow Wilson School. He has authored over 100 academic publications on European integration, transatlantic relations, international organization, and global human rights. His book, The Choice for Europe, is generally considered the most important work on the history of the European Union. And actually, as an undergrad, I had to read it. In addition to his prolific work as an academic, opinionist, and policy advisor, I was delighted to discover that Professor Moravcsik is also an established authority for his writing on opera and classical music, a true European intellectual. I'm now done with these formalities, and I look forward to an exciting evening with all of you. Thanks.
It's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome one of Europe's great politicians and thinkers here to address us on the problems of European integration. Romano Prodi began as one of us, as a scholar. He was a professor at the University of Bologna, a university that he reminded us at dinner is considerably older than Princeton University. He was professor of economics, but economics in the broader sense. Economics combined with law and political science, a specialist in competition policy and small and medium enterprises and industrial policy. And he took that into the policy world, working in reconstruction and industrial policy in Italy, entering into politics in the 1970s, but remaining academically active at the same time. He held positions at Stanford, at Harvard, elsewhere. He entered into government at the top of the government in Italy as prime minister, or president of the council as it's known there, two times, twice defeating Berlusconi at the head of a coalition, first at the head of the Olive Branch coalition in the 1990s, holding office from 1996 to 1998, and then again from 2006 to 2008 at the head of the Unità coalition. Quite an achievement in the rough and tumble world of Italian politics, both times holding together a coalition for 2 years or a little bit more in under very difficult and trying circumstances. In between those experiences in domestic politics, he went to Brussels and became one of the very few people who's been president of the European Commission, one of the handful top positions in the European Union, and one of the few positions where one can really take a leadership role pushing issues forward. And among the decisive issues that Romano Prodi pushed forward was the entry of 10 new countries into Europe in the enlargement in 2004, the establishment of the euro in 11 countries a few years previously, and a number of other issues in the early 2000s. We often think, because of the constitutional debates in Europe during that period of recent years, of being a period of failure in Europe, and in fact much got done in that period, and much of it was due to Romano Prodi's efforts. After his second retirement from Italian politics, and he was no longer seen, as many people saw him at the time, bicycling across the television screens of Italy, something that became something of a symbol of him. He's been active on the broader global and political and scholarly scene. In 2008, United Nations Secretary Ban Ki-moon selected him as president of the African Union peacekeeping effort, and then later that year he was named professor at large at Brown University, so he spends a couple of months there, during which time he's now here to address us in this lecture. Despite the fact that he's spent quite a bit of time as a researcher and at major American universities, this is his first trip to Princeton, so I'd like you to help me welcome a great Italian, a great European, a great scholar, Romano Prodi.
Good evening, and I have to stay close to the microphone because otherwise you don't listen. I have a low voice. No, I am really very happy to be here in Princeton. Very happy, not only because this is the first time I am here, I have been taken by the beauty of the campus, but also because I have the occasion to talk to you about Europe in a delicate moment of the development of European institutions, and also in a day in which the new leaders of the European Union have been appointed a few hours ago, and that could be a change in our perspective. So I want to start this conversation telling you what happened to me few days ago. I was in a meeting in Madrid, and in the debate one of my interlocutors asked me abruptly, but Europe is a laboratory or is a museum? And you know, this question brings us just in front of the problem whether Europe is looking to the past or is looking to the future. Because if we look at European Union history, we found that this has been the most innovative and most important political laboratory of all the 20th century. It never happened. I know it, but you know, the problem is the mic. This is no, this is not working. You know, this is not easy to stay close to that, but I shall try anyway. It's better. If you look at European history, in the 20th century, Europe has been the most important political laboratory in the world. From the institutional point of view, the most important innovation came and were born in Europe certainly since the beginning, the idea of Europe was a great innovation. When you think that after the war, after the bloody Second World War, in which you have dozens of millions of dead, the idea of three European leaders, to put together the instrument of the war, coal and steel, and to start from this idea to bring peace in the world, to prevent any war. And this was already a fantastic innovation. Even if, look, when I talk to the young people about that, when I tell them that Europe has brought peace in the world after, let's say, century and century in which always there were wars in Europe, nobody cares about that. Now peace is given for granted. And the fact that Europe has brought peace does not make any excitement to the new generation. But this was the great first achievement, to bring peace in a continent that was always full of hate, of death, of casualties. And this was done looking at the future, not looking at the past. Then, from that there were other innovation in the European laboratory. The second step was mainly economic, to create a common market. And this was the second step that changed the face of Europe, because creating this big market, we have given the possibility also to countries like Italy. They were out of the great economic development to start a new phase of their history. But this was accompanied by new institutions. It was not only a common market. The second phase was to try to have a political unity. So we had a European sort of government called the Commission, a parliament, and the European Council, that was, let's say, the aggregation of the national states that were members of the European Union. And they started to produce a great amount of set of legislation that was called, with a European jargon, l'acquis communautaire, in different fields, from justice to competition, from environment to free circulation of goods and people. So the transformation of the institutional transformation was really a deep change from the national Westphalian state to some sort of new concept of nationality. This was the start of the change, but also from the territorial point of view was an enormous change and progress. European Union started with 6 countries: Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, Holland and Luxembourg. In 1973, Denmark, United Kingdom and Ireland came in. In 81, Greece. In 86, Spain and Portugal. In 95, Austria, Sweden and Finland. And then the great enlargement of 2004, in which Cyprus, Malta, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia and Hungary entered. and in 2007 Romania and Bulgaria. So a complete change in which the last enlargement, the enlargement of 2004 and 2007, had a very peculiar political characteristic. There were 8 and then 2 additional members of the former Soviet Union or of the Warsaw Pact that entered in one day in the European Union. The 1st of May of 2004, there was this enormous change with 80 million of new Europeans, with a real change of the map of Europe, and also with a decision that was in some way surprising many people and also many politicians. As a matter of fact, we were asked to start the examination of 5 new member countries in 10 years, and we did 10 new member countries in 5 years, plus Romania and Bulgaria 2 years later. Why? Because it was clear that the political window was open in that moment, and if it should have not filled the empty space, certainly we should have had terrible consequences in the European political history. Think deeply what should have happened now with the tension between Russia and the European states if Poland or the other new members would have not been parts of the European Union. Imagine the instability of Europe without the quick action of enlargement, and it was not only a change of the geopolitics of Europe, but it was something deeper. You know, it was. I don't want to be polemic, you know, but it was really the only case of export of democracy in the world. Why export of democracy? Because it was not done through force or through menace, but it was just an offer that the new member countries accepted and wanted, and it was a fantastic exercise in terms of political innovation. We divided the acquis communautaire, let's say the European legislation, in 31 different chapters. Each chapter was agriculture, free circulation of goods, justice, energy, taxation, environment. All the legislation discussed chapter by chapter, one by one, with the potential new members. They changed the legislation, they put in front of the Parliament, the new legislation came, discussed with the Commission, other changes were done, working day and night to adapt the institutional structure to the new reality. And I repeat, I have never found in history any of this type of experiment. I never find the negotiations going so deeply and so clearly inside the reality of the country. And it was also emotional, you know, because it's there was a genuine desire, a will to become members of the European Union after so many years of dictatorship, of you know, exclusion from the world community. I do remember, you know, it's I was in the beginning of the negotiation with Romania, very poor country with all the Ceausescu problems, you know, you remember history, you know, and discussing the reason, the foundation of Europe, and all the political parties made speech in favor of Europe, you know. Then a man went up and he defined himself a member of the non-Hungarian minority of the Romanian parliament. Can you listen to the complexity of Europe, the complexity of Europe. And he made a fantastic speech of, about Europe, peace, development. You know, then in the end I asked, you know, why you are so warm for entering into Europe? And he told simply, look, my grandfather was killed because member of a minority. My father was expelled because member of a minority. And I want to enter into Europe because Europe is a union of minorities. The best definition that I tried to adopt for the European Union was given me in the Romanian by a member of the non-Hungarian minority of the Romanian parliament, you know, because this is the real spirit of Europe, you know, that we have to preserve the reason why Europe was born, to protect all the European citizens against the, you know, the oppression of the majority. And this is the reason why we had the expansion of Europe, and so many countries wanted to enter, because the rules, the European rules, in which you have one commissioner per country, small or big, you know, Malta with 300,000 inhabitants has one commission, Germany with almost 80 million inhabitants as one commissioner. And, you know, you have a parliament in which you have the proportion, but in which the small countries have more than the proportion of their member of the parliament, in which you have not only development. This, I want to stress this, because the biggest achievement in Europe has been that the new member states, the new poor member states, I am not talking about the United Kingdom, of course, but of Spain, Portugal, Greece, and then the East European country, all have grown up more than the average after the entrance in the Union, because of solidarity, because of a policy of cohesion policy, we call of regional policy, helping the most poor regions in Europe. So we had a policy of solidarity that worked well. Of course you have complaints, but the distance between the wealthiest countries and the poorest countries has substantially decreased after any operation of enlargement. And this is against economic theory, you know, in which when you have a development of an organization, you know, the core is better off than the periphery of the system. But really you had regional policy, support of backward areas, and a help on the poorest region, and the result has been more equality. Then, you know, this was the expansion of the continent, but then after this enlargement we are now living in a period in which there is some sort of change in the European spirit, you know. In our plan it was written also that the enlargement needed to go immediately or very soon in the direction of the former Yugoslavian countries. Croatia is ready since many years, you know. All the chapters in which we divided our legislation are met by Croatians, you know. But in this moment, in the last years, Europe was taken by fear, was taken by a problem of division, was taken by the difficult perspective for the future. And so we have a period of, let's say, less faith, less confidence in the future development of the continent. This reflects, when you look at the enlargement, also with the famous and important Turkish case. There was a commitment to enlarge Europe also, to start negotiation also with Turkey, but step by step the European public opinion changed. The governments that engaged themselves to open up to Turkey requested an internal referendum in order to implement this decision. The public opinion in Europe was moving against this enlargement, and now we are in a terribly difficult situation in which there are commitments vis-à-vis Turkey, but with the referendum, with the fact that we need a popular referendum, is almost impossible that this commitment is delivered, that can be, and then so we have also from this point of view a real stop to the enlargement of the Union. And the problem of enlargement, where are the borders of Europe, is an unsolved problem. I tried 3 times, I asked 3 times to the European Parliament to open a debate, where are the borders of Europe? And it was absolutely impossible, because this is one of the most delicate problems. There still is a question mark for the future that I don't think will be solved in the near future. To avoid, you know, this clash and to prepare, you know, some sort of better understanding of the problem, the Commission proposed a new idea to create the so-called Ring of Friends. Let's say all the countries in the border of Europe, from Belarusia to Ukraine, to Moldova, but also Georgia if it is not on the border, and Armenia, Israel, Syria, Egypt, Morocco, all these countries, to prepare from them an institution called the Ring of Friends, in which they can share with the Union everything, but not the institution, not be member of the Parliament, not be member of the Commission, but to share the trade policy, cultural policy, agricultural policy, all the chapters of the European rules, but not being members of the Parliament of the... And, you know, I hope that in the future this will be possible, you know, if a country wants to start to have around Europe this area of peace and cooperation. But looking at the laboratory, the most innovative change of the modern state certainly has been the euro. As you know, the currency and the army are the 2 pillars of the modern state, and to put together the currency, it was really something that it was absolutely unexpected, and it was just something that many people thought it was impossible. And why was it? You know, because after the fall of the Berlin Wall, many European countries were against the German unification. In these days there were a rediscovering of the archives in which you read how Mrs. Thatcher and Mitterrand, they were strongly against the German unification. And even in Italy there were positions against it. And so Helmut Kohl, the German Chancellor, he understood that he needed to demonstrate that the new Germany, so big compared to other European states, was not the old Germany. And so I do remember how many times he told me, I want to demonstrate that we shall not have a German Europe, but a European Germany, that we should be. And so I shall give up to the Deutsche Mark, that is the stronghold of my country, to adopt together with the others a new currency. And it was really something that I do remember that when the Chinese president, we had the bilateral meeting between the European Commission and the Chinese government. They were absolutely taken by the idea of the euro. They asked me, but really, you will have a currency, you will have a paper with your currency. Really, the Deutsche Mark and the French franc will disappear. The second meeting, really, that we can keep it in our reserves. I say, yes, of course, you know. Then the euro came, and somebody of you will certainly remember that the euro went down in the first year, you know, collapsed. So when I went back for the next meeting, he was, you know, I was a little afraid. And the Chinese president told me, look, you have given me a very bad advice, but I shall go on buying euros for two reasons. One political reason and one economic reason. The economic reason is that the euro will go up, and he was right, too much went up, you know. But the second reason is that I want to live in a world in which there is not only one Lord. And so to have the euro close to the dollar, side by side with the dollar for China, is a guarantee. And meditate how the world has changed. 7 years after, that is now, the Chinese don't anymore talk about euro and dollars. They talk about the idea of new currency in which you have euro, dollar, renminbi and others, you know. In very few years, the perception of the world has completely changed. And I think that we have to meditate to this event. But so in the end of this experiment, let's say Europe now is an entity with 496 million people, number one in the world in terms of GNP, more than United States, more than any other part of the world, not in terms of individual GNP, of course, individual income, but in terms of total income. The biggest exporter in the world, with you know, some sort of balanced discipline, but in political terms, Europe is not an actor, is a spectator. And this is really the contradiction of the situation that we have. In theory, the potentials of a world leader, in real terms, only a spectator in the political life of the world. Wherever I go from Middle East, especially in the Middle East, you know, in Palestine, in Israel, in the other areas of the world, everybody asks me why you don't take political decisions. You are the biggest trader with us, you are the biggest investor, and you don't take any decision, and you don't participate to the decisions that are concerning us. And the same situation is in the economy. We are, as I told you, we are the biggest economic entity in the world. We have a common currency, but we have not a common economic policy. We have not a common taxation. And this as consequence, take the last crisis. The crisis started by the United States, but the biggest consequence were in Europe. The long-lasting consequence in terms of decrease of income are in many European countries for a simple reason. When the crisis started, the American president decided to inject in the American economy $100 billion. I don't know if are too many or too few, but the decision was taken. The Chinese president decided to put in the economy $585 billion, and he did it. The European countries, the different policies were different country by country. The British government decided to inject a lot of money to save banks in the system. France mainly to reinforce the French industry. Germany and Italy, they preferred the policy of almost non-intervention, and each country has taken different decisions. So in this situation, it becomes much difficult to tell you there is a European policy, European decision-making center. So the giant is the giant made of many dwarfs, one upon the other one, not a giant with strength and muscles as the giant must have. If you take foreign policy, in the recent history, think to Iraqi war. Half the European countries were in favor and half against. And I tell you that this was one of the most tragic moments of the European policy. The dispute we had among us, they were unbelievable, really unbelievable. So deep, so tough. And there was no possibility of a European influence in this decision that has been so important for all of us. And the same I can tell you on the problems of financial governance in the last G20. The position of the European countries were different among them. So to go back to become a laboratory and not a simple museum, what we have to do? We have in front of us very simple decisions to have and to build up again a stronger union. First of all, I have listed all the achievements, but I have to be very honest that in one important mission we, I don't say failed, but almost failed. Let's say the difficult process of having a new constitution. We started with project of strong constitution. It was impossible to have an agreement because of the difference in the idea of the future supranational powers. Then we had a compromise. The compromise was blocked by the French and the Dutch referendum. Then we had another compromise, that was the Lisbon Treaty. The compromise was blocked by the Irish referendum. A country of 4 million people blocked it, but this is democracy. These are the rules of Europe that must be changed, but these are the existing rules. And so they blocked the change of 500 million people. Then with another referendum in Ireland, and then we had the Lisbon Treaty approved, and today the new President of the Union was appointed, and the new, let's call, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Union was appointed. But the Lisbon Treaty does not change, yes, some innovation, the new President and the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, but the powers of both of them are, well, very, very poor, let's say, are more ceremonial than of substance. Because, and this is the point, all the decisions, the main decision in Europe must be still taken at unanimity. And so even a small country can block everything. And unanimity is a tragedy, because when you exercise the veto right, you are a giant even if you are a dwarf. Imagine a prime minister of a country of 300,000 people going back, I blocked Europe, it's some sort of triumph, I defended the interest of our country. And so this is not democracy. With the unanimity you cannot run anything, you cannot run even a football club or nothing, And this is the main problem, because it is a rule that is absolutely, I don't say impossible, but very, very, very difficult to change. And second problem is that the Europeans have different voice in all the international bodies. In the Security Council you have France and the UK, in WTO all the European countries have a different share, a quota of IMF, and so they don't have any influence. And the only body in which the Europeans vote together, the WTO, Europe has a lot of importance, because simply they vote together. And so I think that if we want to restart our laboratory, first of all we must arrive to the end of unanimity. Second, we must have a substantial budget. Nobody knows that the budget of the European Union is only 1% of the European GDP. 1% is nothing. And with this 1%, you have to cover the expenses of agriculture policy, of bureaucracy, of all the representation of the European Union abroad, everything with 1% of the GDP. And when I proposed to pass from 1% to 1.14%, there was a reaction of the most part of the member states, and the budget has been kept at the level of 1%. And with this limit, clearly, you can't play an autonomous role in world policy. Third condition, we must have an exit clause. Let's say, in the European Union, you must have a door to come in, but also a door to get out. If you don't accept, the main changes, for example, the Irish referendum that I repeat, we were obliged to respect because these are the rules, but it was an absurdity because voting yes, okay, you approved the Lisbon Treaty. Voting no, nothing happened. Simply, the treaty could not be approved, but the country remained as before, member of the Union with the same prerogative, blocking all the others, but without any consequence. If you put the question, look, there is in front of you the perspective of a big change. You can decide to stay in or to get out. The decision is in this case very, very, very different. Fourth, as I hinted before, a common representation in the international bodies, because IMF, World Bank, and so on. I know that this is absolutely utopian, that is something that will not be approved in the present moment, but I do understand that our American friends are really worried or fed up when the European countries vote in a different way in these international bodies or have a different position. So how can, this is the opinion of many American politicians, how can we have a common position, how can we have a policy vis-à-vis Europe if there is not a common will on the European side? And the last consequence, the last change that we must have is to create, in many cases, a multi-speed Europe. Let's say, if a number of countries want to do something more together, they must have the possibility to do it, as it happened with the Euro. Not all the European countries are members of the Euro. I recall you that in the beginning we were 11 countries, now there are 16 countries that are members of the Euro. And this is a methodology that we must adopt in the future, to do something more together, leaving the door open to others. Clearly, if you do something in a small number of countries and then you keep the other nations out, this is anti-European. But if you want to do something more, you must be free to do it, because then the others, if they want, will follow, And this is indispensable to be a credible partner for the United States. I want to spend only 1 minute in the end of this conversation, telling that I do think that in this new multipolar and global world, that is, we live in the moment of uncertainty, because there are new leaders, think to the BRICS, thinks mainly to China and India, think to the new events that happen in the world. We are in front of the moment of uncertainty, and I am absolutely convinced that you can't have a reference point if you have not a strong link between United States and Europe. I think that any choice that US will do concerning China, concerning Brazil, concerning Russia, concerning India, is not contradictory with the fact that will be absolutely vital and positive to have a link with a continent that is more similar in values, more similar in democracy, more similar in tradition, and and so that this is a strong point that I have in my mind. But clearly it's not easy, also because on the United States side there is still the old question that Kissinger made many decades ago. If I have to call, give me the telephone number of Europe. If I have to call somebody, whom, which number? I dial. This is still a problem, So we must offer to American government, if not one number, at least a switching board, in which somebody that can orientate, the counterpart. This is, I think, is easier now, because it was more difficult a few years ago, because I remember that in a few cases contrary to all the American policy in all the post-war period, in which United States always helped Europe. During the Iraqi war, there was a deliberate division between old and new Europe, and this was a sad moment for me and for the European. But the long-lasting interest is to be together, and so I think that on the American side it will be important to help and to push in the direction of more European cohesion, because I think that this is really a common interest, and clearly I am not in a hurry. I know that such an enormous change in the concept of state, of government, of nation, that if the European Union will need time, we need decades in front of us, but we must have clear the idea that this will be really useful for peace, for development. I repeat, it's not easy. Think only to the language. When I was in the Commission, we have only 3 working languages: English, French, and Germany. And of course, I have never pronounced any word in Italian, my mother language. But when I entered into the Parliament, I was speaking only Italian. But in the Parliament, the European Parliament, there are 22 different languages. And to shape unity with these difficulties is a problem. So it is a great effort. But if we want to build really a new reality in the world, I think that the European example is really the most important example that we can have in front of us, and is the best laboratory that is available in our present history. So I think that Europe is a nice museum, but is also an important laboratory for the mankind. Thank you.
So we have 2 mics, and we are gonna pick like a couple of questions and then let the President respond and have other questions more. Let's do 3 questions, okay? We start this side and one, okay?
Do you think that the fact that Europe is...
Can you speak louder, please?
Do you think that the fact that Europe is so dependent on Russian energy makes it difficult for the United States to work with Europe on Russia?
Yeah. Second. Second question.
It's on.
First, may I respectfully request that with distinguished visitors such as President Prodi, perhaps we spend more than 1% of the budget on a improved public address system so that we can hear the speaker better. It's not difficult to do. Second, President Prodi, if I may, you have spoken very much about the benefit of enlarging Europe, the benefit of peace and all of these kind of things. There is a big disconnect, I feel, between all of these excellent goals and what the individuals in Europe think. The individual members of the public are not very interested in Europe, and so they see all the politicians talking about grand enlargement, increasing the % of the budget and so on, but they're not so interested in Europe. What can we do about that? And does something like what happened today, when people who are completely unknown are elected to, appointed to the most senior positions in Europe?
Thank you.
Europe do to reassure Russia as it expands out into its the former Soviet states through its actions in the European partnership and the European neighborhood policy? What can Europe do to reassure Russia as it expands out through the European neighborhood policy and the Eastern Partnership?
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure to have picked up well the first question. Energy dependency about Russia. I think that with energy, Russia is trying to maximize the Russian power. I am not surprised about that, because Russia is using the energy policy as an instrument of power, and also as an instrument to keep Ukraine on its hands. That is one of the main goals of President Putin. But I am surprised that Europe does not react as should be. Let's say we have a monopoly, not a monopoly, but a quasi-monopoly, you know, gas coming from Russia, but the European countries, they don't link together their pipes. And we have not a big monopolist, a big purchaser vis-à-vis a big seller. And so at least in part I blame ourselves, because strength by strength, you could react as you could do in a normal situation like that. And so I tell you, I found myself to discuss with the Polish leaders, the twins Kaczynski, when they were President of the Republic and Prime Minister of Poland. They were furious because the Germans and Poland decided to build a pipeline, submarine pipeline, arriving straight to Germany. And, I said, look, Germans and Russians are making a conspiracy against us, and we discussed about that. So my opinion was very clear. Why you don't help us to build a European network of pipelines, to link together all the pipelines? And if the gas arrives to Poland or to Germany, is absolutely indifferent, but this is a case in which we have still to work for a common policy, because we have not a common policy of energy. In spite, we are the biggest purchaser of energy in the world. In this moment we are dependent from external energy more and more, and we shall depend more and more. So it's not a problem to ask Putin to be merciful or to change policy. Simply, look, you have to sell your gas, we have to buy it. The seller is not stronger than the buyer, if the buyer is a strong buyer. So this is my opinion regarding energy, Russian energy. The new development of that are that Putin is trying to, I repeat, to bypass Ukraine, and this is very high cost. I don't know whether with the decrease of demand of energy in Europe because of the crisis and because of the LNG arriving to Europe, liquefied natural gas, if this new project of investment will be really viable. I have some doubt now. I think that even the Russian policy could change because of the change of the market. Second, people are not interested in Europe. Well, why to be surprised? There are European media. The media are, and I also did it in my life before going to Brussels, to blame Brussels if something goes wrong in your country. When you make a mistake, you say, it was Brussels, it is Brussels, it is Europe that orders us. And because you have no European media, this game is very easy to play. And but I think that this is not easy to countervail if you have not step by step a change in media. You have some more, some discussion concerning also European policy, but not enough. The big change will be media, and when you will have a political battle, continent. In this moment, if you have a political battle between, let's say, a German socialist and a French Christian Democratic, or in this case, people understand well that there is a political change. So my deep feeling that you have to politicize Europe. Simply, otherwise you have a split between public opinion and rules. The third question, I'm sorry, but if you repeat it, I didn't get it.
It's a very simple question with a difficult answer. As Europe continues to expand the European neighborhood, how can Europe reassure Russia of its fears that Europe is building an empire?
It is a difficult question, but an easy answer. It's simple, you know. I tell you my experience that when there was the last meeting in which I participated as Prime Minister was on enlargement of NATO to Ukraine and Georgia, and I voted against. I said there is no reason to bring NATO on the border of Russia if we have not a policy. You know, why to wake up the assertiveness of Russia without a strategic idea what to do. Second, as I hinted before, I don't see any diverging interest between United States, among United States, Russia and Europe. Russia and United States, they have common interest to decrease military expenditure. They have budget problem. I don't think that to have so strong military presence vis-à-vis Russia would be useful. I have found a very wise decision, the Obama decision, to not to install the new missiles in Poland. The Polish and the Czech have been resented for a couple of weeks, but no more, because they understood, they are understanding that there is no strategic purpose to do it. And I repeat, if I trying to be rational, I think that there is a common interest also for the complementarity of the European economy and Russian economy, and of the political interest of US and Russia, that there could be an agreement, because I repeat, I don't see strong reasons to have that. You know, when in a European Union-Russia summit, you know, they asked me which are the relations between European Union and Russia, and my answer was, is like vodka and caviar, completely interdependent. We can fight so on, but Russia will not live without selling gas to Europe. The productive structure of Russia is horrible. The country has not been able to diversify from gas and oil. They need Europe in any aspect of their life, and we need energy and gas. And so I think that we have to be to be wise and understand which are the reciprocal interests. I also do remember that we have also some old responsibilities. I do remember when the Soviet Union in the G8 meeting when Russia collapsed, Soviet Union collapsed, and in the G8 meeting in 1991 they came for help, and this was denied. This was denied, you know, and the Western countries said no. And I think that this was a moment, it was a great mistake, because reopened the Russian nationalism, and you know, and then look, I do remember when in the years of the humiliation of Russia, the star of Putin started back started to come up, you know, that Gorbachev, he called me, he came to visit me, telling, look, a new leader is rising in Russia. His curriculum vitae is not the curriculum that you prefer, but it's the only one that can avoid to have a nuclear war, to reorganize Russia, not against the Western world, but with compatible interests between Europe and Russia. Maybe he was exaggerating, but I think that the deep meaning of this word are still worthwhile. We must defend our interests, but we must defend them with intelligence and knowing which are the limits of our interests and the Russian interests, and which are the deep complementarity. So, not to menace bringing to the Russian borders the alien that is not needed to go till there, and being strong vis-à-vis the Russian energy arm twisting. You know, this is what we have to do, and this is the reason why I think that an agreement will be possible and not so difficult.
Other two questions, and then we'll close.
Thank you. President Prodi, you pointed out the example of the euro, the creation of the euro as an example of an innovation. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
As an example of an innovation that supports your idea of Europe as a laboratory. But how do you respond to the criticism of many Italians, for example, who lament that since the advent of the euro, their buying power has been diminished, and what they used to be able to buy for 1,000 euro, for instance, or 1,000 lira, they cannot buy for the same amount of goods for 1 euro.
No, the question is correlated to the, let's say, the ups and downs of the currencies. Look, the world now is still dominated by the fluctuation of the dollar, you know, and the euro comes as a consequence, you know, because there is not a world market so deep and so wide for the euro as you have for the dollars, you know. So the result has been a an enormous increase in the value of the euro vis-à-vis the dollar, and I think that we arrived to a critical point now. 1.50 is putting Europe in deep strain, European industry and European export in deep strain. But, you know, I am not an expert in rate of exchange forecasts, but there are no signal of a change of this trend. And this is one of the most dangerous perspective that we have in front of us for the future. Because if we go on in the say increase of the euro vis-à-vis the dollar, we could have some deep crisis, and it's not easy to have let's say agreement in the monetary front, also for the reason that I have tried to express tonight, that there is not a common policy in Europe, there is only monetary policy, so the complex of running the relation between the currencies is very, very difficult. But personally, I think that we have already arrived to the limit beyond which there will be negative effect in both sides of the Atlantic. 1.50, it put under strain all the European economy.
Thank you for speaking with us, Prime Minister Prodi. I have a more historical question. I was wondering, in 1978, when Aldo Moro was hostage, you gave information as to his whereabouts and claimed to have received it from spirits via an Ouija board. Do you still stand by this explanation today?
I really here, it's difficult to listen to me. Can you come here?
Okay, excuse me. This is what I've read, and correct me if I am wrong.
Come here, please. It's a problem of voice. Tell me.
Yes. Honored to meet you, sir. My question was, in 1978, and this is what I have read. Correct me if I'm wrong, but 1978, when you gave, when you and the faculty at Bologna gave information as to the whereabouts of Aldo Moro, you claimed that it came from a séance. Do you still stand by this story today?
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
There are other questions?
Sorry. We are recorded, so it's better to use microphone. Thank you.
Professor Prodi, you've been instrumental in enlarging Europe, and I understand what you said, that it was a narrow window. I presume that you meant that we wanted to grab Romania, Bulgaria before Russia would grab. But you lamented the fact that now there are many different nationalities and many languages, many so different. You gave me the impression that Europe, you described Europe not as a union, but as a confederation. And as you know, here, United States knows very well what was the difference between a confederation and a union. Just to summarize everything, do you believe that it's going to be a union, especially now that, you know, it cannot be just an experimental laboratory. China is coming up too strong. There is no time to do experiments. Can Europe become a union quick or not?
No, quick. I have been clear when I told in the end of my speech that we shall need decades to become a union. You know, it's a slow process. But I'm sure, just because what you told in your question, that because of the challenge coming from China, that will come from India, we shall be pushed to stick together. The example that I do always is this. I am an Italian, you know, and in the Renaissance period, the Italian states were really leading in, you know, in many fields, in finance, in military organization, in art, philosophy. Think to Venice, think to Milan, to Rome. There was the first globalization, that was the discovery of America, and the Italian state did not stick together, and Italy disappeared from the world map. I think that the European states are precisely in the same situation in this second globalization. Germany, France, UK, even if they are powerful states, they are, you know, weakened, they are weak vis-à-vis the future China, India, or United States. And so I am convinced that this challenge will push the Union, unless we prefer to disappear, because the Italian case was clear. It's in a couple of generations, the overpowerful Italian state were simply a field of battle for the armies of the big national states. And this is, I think that this is precisely the destiny of Europe if we will not be united. Now I have been honest to tell you which are the difficulties, which are the nationalistic voices still getting around, and this is what this is why we shall need decades to make the union.
Okay.
Last question, let's say.
Okay, last, because we really have to close.
I think you said nicely that it's a great experiment, and I think it's a great experiment for this century to deserve for a Nobel Prize. Having said that, different regions in the world, they are in fact copying the European Union model, like African Union, and there is a talk about South Asian Union. So I think there is a need to propagate this great experiment to other countries so that the people can come closer and they can have a more interdependency.
Yes, this is a great question, you know, because I think that first of all, Africa needs a union, you know. The situation in Africa is very clear. If we have not multilateralism in Africa, Africa is lost. Simply, there is no African country with a dimension big enough to have an internal market, to have, let's say, some sort of sufficient organization. And so for Africa, I'm absolutely clear. Asia is different. Asia is the continent in which you have big countries with a dimension that, you know, for a national country is a dimension that is fitted for a world of a world role, and so it's is a different case. In Asia, what I think not the possibility of having something similar to the European Union, but certainly you could expect evolution that will help to change, will make a change in the world structure. Let's say if there is an approach between Japan and China with the new Japanese government, with an exchange of technology and more cooperation, this will give you already another change in the world political dimension. You know, it's I do expect this type of change, not not a copy of the European experiment. It's too different, the Asian reality. For Africa, I repeat, if there is no something similar, the continent is lost. The continent is lost. You know, Africa can't go on in this situation, and the European countries have not helped Africa to have this sense of the union. You know, each country traditionally keeps its relation with the African countries that were traditionally linked. You know, and this is something that works against the development and the peaceful, the economic development and the peaceful development of Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.